Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. The year 2020 is almost, finally, blessedly over, and we are winding down the 5th season of Enterprising Individuals, and the show finds itself at a crossroads. When I started this show, didn't have no plan, didn't see no arc, to quote LP from Run the Jewels. Just run with the craft, have a couple laughs, make a buck and dash. When momentum started to pick up in our 3rd year, I was just glad there were still things to talk about. When we closed the 4th season, I was just glad we'd matched Enterprise. Now we're reaching the end of year 5, and we're getting ready to lap the Enterprise and her 5-year mission, and I'm wondering, what's next? Do we give the Enterprise D and her 7 years a run for her money? If you know that Run the Jewels song that I quoted before, and if you don't know Run the Jewels, check them out. They're great. The song says, "I drink like a Vulcan, losing all faith in the logical, and I want to do what's logical. I'd like for the show to go out on top. I don't want it to get to a point where we're making the same points. We're covering the same ground. We're not saying anything new." The world of Trek is about as big as the galaxy, and I've always assumed that there's always something new to talk about, but maybe my instruments aren't working right. Maybe I don't know how to get there from here. So I'm asking you, as a fan of the show, to tell me where you want this ship to take you. What do you want to hear more of on the show? What topics do you want covered? Who do you want to hear them from? What do you want to hear about? I'm at a place where I can either go out on top or stay here. I'd like to go on, but not if it's going to be diminishing returns. I want to go out high. Woo! I feel high. But if we can get higher, that's where I want to go. So let me know what you think. More Enterprising Individuals or no more? If you want an idea of where we've been this year, you're in luck. Next week is our final episode of 2020, except for, of course, our continuing coverage of Star Trek Discovery Season 3. And as is custom, it will be a clip show featuring some of the best moments from the year. And we've got clip shows from Season 2 on, if you're interested. So listen to next week's show, maybe listen to those previous shows, look around the show's catalog on iTunes, your listening platform of choice, or on enterprisingindividuals.com, and tell me, do we have farther to go, or are we there yet? LP says in that song that he's scared that he talks too much about what he thinks is going on. Me too. Let me know if I should keep talking on social media at EISTpod, on Discord, or email at eistpod@gmail.com. This week on the show, an episode forged in the fires of adversity, and one I'm excited to finally present to you. The recording of this show got put off for multiple varied reasons of 2020, force majeure, or otherwise, but we finally got it done. I recently spoke with Dr. Djoymi Baker. Dr. Baker has a PhD in Star Trek. Sort of. Her dissertation was entitled Broadcast Space, TV Culture, Myth, and Star Trek, and in it she examined the efforts of early TV to secure cultural legitimacy, the self-reflexivity of long-lasting TV franchises, and a postmodern re-examination of myth in contemporary culture. She watched the entirety of Star Trek and broke down how Trek really views itself and the ways in which it leverages its content and its reputation as a franchise to create a new mythology for modern times. And she wrote a book about it as well. It's called To Boldly Go, Marketing the Myth of Star Trek. Every other week, the Starship Enterprise is running into some alien or other who claims to be God or a whole pantheon of gods. And we talk about that, but we also talk about the ways that Trek uses mythic storytelling and heroic tropes to tell its own tales of heroism. We had a great talk. It was a lot of fun, and I hope you have fun listening to it. Like I said, we'll be back next week. In the meantime, join us on Thursday nights for the next couple of weeks as we finish out Season 3 of Star Trek Discovery on our live review show, Discoverage. Stop by patreon.com/EISTpod to become a crew member of the show. We'll see you next week for our Christmas clip show. Kirk met God, Sisko became a god, Picard argued with gods, Archer played God, and Janeway was God. Don't at me. Enjoy the show, and with that, let's get underway. My guest on the show today is Dr. Djoymi Baker. Dr. Baker is a lecturer in media and cinema studies at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. She's also the author of To Boldly Go, Marketing the Myth of Star Trek, and a co-author of the Encyclopedia of Epic Films, as well as many essays and articles on entertainment and genre. Djoymi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's great to have you here, and I always ask new guests on the show how they first became Star Trek fans. How did you first discover Star Trek?
I guess my parents had been watching it back in the day, but really it was because my brother was a complete Trekkie and was part of the fan club and everything. And so he drew me into it. And I used to go to the fan club meetings where we'd watch episodes, people would dress up, the whole shebang. So I was really a fan of Star Trek way before I was ever a scholar of Star Trek. And it was a bit of a family affair, I guess.
Yeah. That's a common story. Having somebody who a lot of people notice their parents watching it, weren't attracted by the monsters or the bright colors, and then as they grew older, went, okay, I can see there's something here that interests me beyond just the sort of genre elements to it.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting. I mean, I write about this, how Star Trek is very intergenerational, but I'm not exactly sure that I'm a great example of that because I've failed fairly miserably to indoctrinate my own children. As not for want of trying, I can tell you, they enjoy the Abrams reboot films.
Sure.
But trying to get them into the TV shows is still a bit of an uphill battle.
That's
so I
funny.
failed as a Trek parent,
That's
I'm
funny.
afraid.
That's mom's thing. Yeah, we're not interested in
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah, like, oh, roll of eyes. Here we go. Yes, all right. We have a family viewing roster where, I got sick of all the arguments. We do try and sit down and watch TV together, whether it's a film or a TV show on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
And my kids are just young enough that that's still flying with them. They'll become a tipping point soon where that's not going to be okay with their social lives. And so I had this roster of who gets to choose what. And, there's always a bit of a rolling of the eyes that goes on with, oh, God, Dad's going to pick another documentary. Okay, Mum, what Star Trek are you going to get us to watch?
Okay, yeah, we'll sit through it for that, to avoid the documentary.
We'll humor you, but yeah.
Your doctoral dissertation was entitled Broadcast Space, TV Culture, Myth, and Star Trek. And for it, you watched all of Trek from TOS to Enterprise, which was all the Trek at that time. And it sounds fun, but it also sounds incredibly daunting, like the kind of thing that, like eating a lot of sweets. At some point it's like, okay, I'm done with sweets. I'm done.
Yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but now, no. Look, it does sound like a lot. And yet, for other Trekkies out there, you add up what your viewing is.
Yeah.
It's probably something pretty comparable. I guess the difference is that if you're not writing about it and you're not really getting into one of the offshoot series, you can kind of call it a day, right? You can say, you know what, there's plenty of other Trek. I don't have to stick with this if it's not my thing. Whereas if you're writing it, you go, okay, right, this I'm just gonna push through this episode that I'm not really loving that much.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess the thing was that I was lucky in that I chose to marry my occupation with one of my great loves. And I thought, if I'm going to write on this, like a dissertation takes like 3 to 4 years to pull off. You've actually got to really like what you're writing about, right? If you're going to spend that much time just devoted to it. And one thing sort of people asked me at the time is, not realizing that I was a fan first, right? This is the kind of question I would get is like, those Trekkies, they're so into Star Trek. They're really over the top, aren't they? One, do your research. Two, I'd look at them and say, yeah, but they do it for fun and I'm doing it for a living.
Right.
So
yeah.
Who's the more obsessive here,
Right, yeah. As a fan, was there a point where you thought, okay, so I like this. Next step, I'm going all the way to PhD with this. Like, what point was that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the seeds of it were when I was watching Star Trek Voyager. because at that time I was actually my undergraduate studies, I was doing classics. So I was doing Greek and Roman mythology.
Uh-huh.
And so I'd be in my classes and, reading Homer. And then I'd come home and watch an episode of Voyager. And they kept name dropping all these myths, and even when they weren't, they were using these mythic templates. And I'm going, hang on, what's going on here?
Sure.
And I guess that sort of sowed the seed. So originally I was going to be a lawyer, and then I decided no. And then the second one, I was going to be a historian. And then somewhere along the line there, I thought, you know what, life is too short.
Yeah.
I'm going to be a Star Trek scholar.
That's so interesting, because often when I watch Star Trek or like Voyager, for instance, as a fan of TV and film and other media, I often see elements that I see that they're referencing or sort of pulling from other things. Often on Voyager, they're pulling from other Star Trek episodes, and you think like, oh, they're doing a TNG episode kind of riff, or if they're doing every series has to do a Rashomon episode where you get the story told from different viewpoints. And there's often mythic elements, but they often go right over my head unless it's like literally Beowulf or something like that. But just in preparing for this conversation and looking back through Trek, I realized, there are a lot of like parallels to myth in just plain old bog standard Star Trek storytelling.
Absolutely. And I think there's a few things there. One is that mythic storytelling has become a pretty broad template for a lot of our entertainment forms and a lot of our storytelling methodologies without us necessarily knowing it. So there's that unconscious replication of mythic tropes, which I think is just happening all the time across a lot of different media forms. But then you add to this very deliberate use of myth where the script writers are going, right, we've got a marketing campaign going at the moment where we're talking about Star Trek using words like myth, legend, saga. Let's bring that into the show itself. Let's bolster this idea that, Star Trek has been around for several generations now. This is the kind of myth making of our own time. Let's really hammer that home by bringing in an episode where we do the Odyssey, by bringing in an episode where we do Beowulf, right? So there's this kind of double layering to it. It's saying it is harking back to these older mythologies, but by doing that, it's kind of saying, but look, now Star Trek is the myth, or at least one of the myths of our own time. That's
interesting that it's self-conscious in that way. Do you think that because Gene Roddenberry knew that he was creating and introducing something that could have an epic scope. It was man's exploration of the literal final frontier, the stars. But I wonder if he would think of it in that same way. Like you were saying, some of the advertising surrounding, especially like the later TOS films where it's like, the saga comes to a close. Like you have to see the final chapter of this and that.
Yeah. So those kind of grandiose terms only come in later. You're right.
Right. TOS is sometimes very workaday. Kirk, their big mission will be delivering supplies to a colony or protecting robot ships, on a trade route, and it's something that they're all very bored with, and they don't consider themselves to be, epic Homeric heroes in space.
No, sometimes they're posties, right? They do use that term over there. They're delivering the post, or they're delivering supply. It's, as you say, it's quite workmanlike. But then we get episodes like Who Mourns for Adonis, where there's definitely a direct link being made between the ancient heroes and the ancient gods and what we have on TOS. Where the god Apollo actually compares Kirk and the other away team members to the heroes of old. So there is a self-awareness there that they're trying to make an alignment with those older sort of heroic archetypes. But, would you really make much of that in the 60s when this was a pretty struggling show, let's face it? I don't think so. I don't think that people were looking at it that way. It's only later, once it has the traction of having survived for decades, that they, that they can legitimately say this is a saga, this is, legendary. I don't really think that, even as much as Roddenberry hoped it to be a very heroic endeavor.
Yeah.
saying that it had any more sort of pop cultural iconic status than that at the actual 60s, I think would have been a bit of a stretch. So I don't really think that he quite anticipated what would become of it.
Speaking of epic things, you're one of the co-authors of the Encyclopedia of Epic Films, which is a compendium of large-scale sort of tentpole films. How did you get involved with that project?
Well, as I said, I started off as a bit of a classics scholar to begin with, and in a parallel universe, I'd be off reading Homer now. So I guess and the way I approached Star Trek by bringing in these connections to myth was a way of kind of marrying those two interests.
Yeah.
So every now and again, I would still be reading things about, particularly the way that classics are adapted onto the screen. So you kind of sword and sandal epics, your mythic tales, your Hercules, your Steve Reeves 1958 bodybuilder, muscle man. I mean, there's quite ridiculous films, but I did love this. So I would be reading in that area, and one of my colleagues who knew that was an interest of mine asked me to write a book review about some new books that had come out on epics on screen. And so I wrote up this little review. And from that, one of the authors who I'd reviewed sort of got in touch and said, would you like to work together? And from that, we kind of assembled a team of people. And it did, to use a terrible pun, it did end up being quite an epic undertaking.
Well,
if you have a look at the book, it's this big, fat compendium. And even then, I'm sure someone could open it up and say, oh, I can't believe that they missed out on this particular film that's my favorite.
Yeah.
We couldn't get them all in. We had a restriction from the publishers. But look, it was a really fun undertaking, even though it was quite a strenuous job to get through all those films, some of which I hadn't seen before doing the book.
Sure.
And I'll kind of continue. That's sort of like one of my little sidelines. Every now and again, I'll pop something out. So I did an article on Dwayne Johnson's performance as Hercules.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I'm writing one on Brad Pitt in Troy. So, every now and again, I pop one of those out. As a little sideline. But I don't actually see them as that being completely different. Like, I know they're different genres, and one's the ancient past and one's like the imagined future. But I guess my argument is that in both those forms, the past and the future are really about talking about today.
Yeah.
We use the lens of the past and the future to filter our ideas from today.
Yeah, that's something that, of course, Star Trek does all the time. I feel like an epic or an event film in the past would cover a war or a historical event or like a historical person's life. But now it seems like every film, at least like summer films, are epic, at least at the expenditure and the amount of VFX people involved in its creation. And do you think that like audiences have developed a taste for the epic or a dependence on it? Because if a movie is 90 minutes now, people wonder like where the rest is, or if it's going to be a trilogy or a quadrilogy just out of the gate.
Yes. And is it still an epic if it's done a lot, or is an epic just defined by being in excess of what's ordinary? Like, is it only the ones that really push that boundaries that we can see as being truly epic? Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. Certainly that sort of big blockbuster spectacle approach is dominant at the moment, but given where the industry is in the hit of COVID-19, whether that will remain the case will be interesting moving forward. Of course, they've had to delay the release of a whole lot of those films. Whether that model ends up serving us is interesting. But I do think there is a definite alignment between the cycles we get of the epic film, and they're often aligned with shifts in technology. So if you look at when the epic has been dominant, it's been the silent era. Even though if anyone wants to go and Google some of those early films, they may not seem very epic to us, but in their time they were. And they were experimenting with the new technologies that they had at the disposal, this great new thing, the moving image. then it kind of dies down again, and then it comes back up with TV, because TV is one of the factors that really impacts Hollywood at the box office. So they go to widescreen, they go to spectacle, casts of thousands.
Right.
You get this real rebirth of the epic, and it dies down again. And when does it come up? Digital technologies.
Sure.
So, you don't have to have the cast of thousands anymore, right? Because
Right.
you can digitize.
Yeah.
You can just copy and paste, just click on the screen. So we see these kind of cycles in the epic coming really align with those kind of technological factors. But yeah, I don't want to prophesize about the future, but it'd be really interesting to see what happens, how the industry bounces back from that, and whether they really go in for it quite on the extent that they have, or whether they just decide to bunker down and do a few tent poles instead.
Yeah.
I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I wonder about that. And I wonder about just not knowing the direct in and outs of Hollywood financing, like how we've got to the point where just your average action movie costs $160 million. And we think about the blockbuster era beginning in the mid-'70s with movies like Jaws and Star Wars, which themselves, they didn't cost nothing, but they didn't cost all that much, and they made a ton of money, and could have just been like these kind of smaller sort of art housey films. And so, yeah, I wonder too how a complete lack of any kind of revenue just this year will affect how they want to go forward in Hollywood. I'd imagine that if it's just this year, it wouldn't change too much. But if restrictions and closures extend, into a significant portion of next year, yeah, I think we'll see a lot of changes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm here in Melbourne, Australia, and we've just come out of an 8-month lockdown.
Wow.
I could be wrong, but I think we've been in the longest lockdown of anywhere in the world. It's been quite hard, and they've just opened up the cinemas again. They don't have really anything to show in them.
Yeah, yeah.
It may well be that Australian films do really well this year because it's all that they've got to show.
Sure.
But I was reading that they've delayed the release of Peter Rabbit 2, but they've decided Wonder Woman's going to come out on plan. Well, these will be the test cases, right? These ones that come out in the midst of this will really determine the next few years what they look like, because Hollywood execs can't wait around. They've got to work out their schedules. They've got to work out what they're going to greenlight in the meantime. So, yes, may we live in interesting times, as they say.
It is chaotic for sure. Yeah. I was preparing for this show, and I was sort of researching your work and your book, and I was thinking about the idea that you present, which is that I think that Star Trek stands at an interesting crossroads of mythic storytelling and commercial concerns. And as a moralistic adventure series with a long history, both in the real world and in its wealth of stories, it's positioned as this bastion of, epic tales, but it's also a product, like we said, made by executives, made by people who are doing it for money. And so when there are new installments in the ongoing franchise that is Trek, those installments both draw upon earlier installments and comment on and add to them in the same way that like new myths or new parables would. But they're also specifically designed to tie back into earlier installments, so they appeal to the established fan base. DS9, a new show after TNG, features TNG characters, races seen in TNG, and Enterprise and Discovery serve to set the stage, for and to add depth to the era in which Kirk and the original crew had their adventures. But, they're spin-offs. So you like that, you're going to like this. So it's like they have this mythic aspect to them, but I wonder if anybody, wrote a myth about Apollo and it was a big hit, and then they went back and tried to write another one. Like it's not a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah, but they did.
Oh yeah, they did.
They did. So, I absolutely agree that it's different, that we need to take that commercial context into consideration, that this isn't you're right, it isn't a one-to-one carbon copy. It is different because of that industrial context, because of that commercial context.
Yeah.
But certainly the spin-offs and the linking to something that's popular, that is there in the mythic tradition.
Yeah.
So you get, say, the 12 Labors of Hercules, they're an add-on They were never there originally.
Yeah.
You get prequels. You get his childhood of Hercules because adult
right.
Hercules is so popular. What haven't we done? Let's do a prequel.
Yeah.
You get all that stuff in the mythic tradition where you get all these add-ons, and it's a little bit harder to trace because those original myths, they were oral myths, right? They're told by they're told in person. So we have them in writing, but not everything got written down, not everything got saved. So it is a little bit piecemeal in that sense. Mm-hmm. But yeah, absolutely. If something was popular, if something hit a vein, they would expand. And I guess this is one of the things that I wanted to say about myth is that traditional myth, quote unquote, isn't static. It's not a book. It's not a dusty old book sitting on someone's bookcase. It was constantly evolving, constantly being added to. But, you're right in that the way in which it expands for something like Star Trek is as much a monetary concern as it is a storytelling concern.
Yeah.
And so the way that you get legacy actors appearing in spin-offs, that's to appeal to the fans, and that's to bring new viewers over or to bring viewers back if they've gone, if the numbers have gone down. They're very strategic choices on the part of the franchise, absolutely.
I know that the box office was big on the death of Hercules, but they shouldn't have brought him back. That was just one step too far. It's never the same after that.
No, exactly right. You're just spoiling it.
Yeah. I think the didactic storytelling of Trek ties it to mythic storytelling in a lot of ways. Just like myths were often developed to explain the natural world in a simplified way, or sometimes political conflicts were aggrandized or became legendary in mythic form. Star Trek often serves a similar purpose, with actual scientific concepts being put into practical, if simplified terms, and the real world and social political events and ideas of our time get played out in allegorical form on Star Trek a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there is that connection of, what are myths for and what were they for back in the day, back in ancient times? And I mean, to begin with, the first time myth gets referred to in a story that we still have, it might have been earlier than that, is in Homer. And there it's just persuasive words. Yeah. It's not even a story. It's not even a type of story. It's only later that this word myth starts to be talked about as being about gods and heroes, and then becomes about allegories, about nature and science, and then even later then becomes associated with untrue stories. So it goes through this evolution.
Interesting.
And you can see all those elements being played out in something like Star Trek. Different worldviews, different social and cultural conflicts.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I write about is how the opening sequences, the title sequences to the different shows, each kind of take a different slant on space, kind of like a cosmology, I guess, where we get a cosmogonic idea of what the universe is like and how we should be situated within it. In some ways that is quite conservative. So even though Star Trek is about going out where we've never been before, a lot of those title sequences are fairly closely tied to home. So I don't know if you remember that in TNG they actually changed the title sequence partway through.
Yes.
I think it was season 3.
Yes.
And so instead of the Enterprise heading out towards space, all of a sudden it was coming back in to the Milky Way and back home. It was like, hang on, this isn't Voyager.
Cosmic navel gazing in that, looking inward. Yeah.
That's right.
That's amazing.
In one of the shows, they mentioned that Sector 00 is Earth. And I was like, hang on, so Earth is at the center of the universe? When did this happen?
Yeah, right.
When did we rearrange the entire universe to put Earth in the center?
It was the me decade when it was when that was changed.
Yeah, that's right. So it's almost as if it's sort of saying, yes, okay, we had the Copernican revolution when we found out we were just in this humdrum little planet on the edge of this insignificant galaxy.
Yeah.
On the unfashionable end of the universe.
Yeah, right.
but the title sequences say, no, we're really important. We're at the center of things, and we're Sector 00. We're where everything's at. So it's kind of, yes, this kind of myth of humanity being really the linchpin of where everything's happening, even though you've got all these other races and we're all equal, but we're slightly more equal than others.
Sure. Right. That's one way to look at it. We were talking before about who mourns for Adonais, which is probably one of the most like explicit mythical references in the Trek canon. And for people who don't know, and I wouldn't imagine most people wouldn't, but any listeners who don't, Kirk and crew go to a planet and they meet a being who claims to be Apollo of, like Apollo. And at first glance, it seems to be, the kind of plot is like it's an Ancient Aliens type situation, a Chariot of the Gods thing where aliens came to our world and were they have amazing abilities and powers, but they were interpreted to be gods. It was a popular idea at the time, but taken from a metatextual perspective, it can be seen as one of the original heroes of Western antiquity, one of the first protagonists of myth saying, you guys don't need me anymore. You're the heroes. You're the storytellers now. I'm defunct. He's literally passing the torch to Star Trek heroes and their storytelling.
Absolutely. So it's one of these things where, on the one hand, it's saying the gods and the myths were actually true, that Apollo existed, that this is all based in fact. This is not, made up.
Right.
So on the one hand, it's affirming myth, but as soon as it does that, it says, yeah, but it's time to move on.
Yeah, right, yeah. Thank you.
It's time to move on straight away.
Right,
yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for civilization as we know it, but, it's time to move on
out
now.
of here, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so funny. And in your book, you talk about how early genre shows on TV co-opted mythology and traditional storytelling tropes to appeal to a broader audience or a younger audience. And it seems like that idea is present in something like Who Mourns for Adonais.
Absolutely. And think about the types of mythic stories that were popular just a little bit before this show went to air. And really it was those kind of sword and sandal epics. And you look at the way that Apollo is dressed, and it's kind of like this guy hasn't updated his fashion sense since the ancient era. Yeah. So those of you who haven't seen the show, he's in this kind of vaguely Greco-Roman toga type outfit. It's in lame, just to update it.
Right,
I'll keep the basic lines, but I might go a little bit sort of futuristic and have some gold lame happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, this guy hasn't changed his architectural sense, his fashion sense. He's just, no, look, once you're onto a good thing, you'll stick with it. And it's really going with the iconography that the audience will understand and associate with ancient world, because they've seen it on the big screen, right? They've seen it in your tacky Hercules films, and they've seen it in your higher budget Hollywood films. So there's a kind of look that people associate with it.
Yeah.
But, on the big screen, those are expensive, right? That's expensive to do all those sets and have those costumes and have the cast of thousands. You can't do that on TV. There just isn't the budget.
Right.
And so this is why, actually what happened in this era, it wasn't that no one was doing myth, but they did tend to end up on children's shows, because on the one hand, you don't have copyright restrictions, right? You don't have to pay for this stuff. Secondly, it's going to keep educators and parents happy in an era where TV is like really seen as suspicious, as a bad influence on children. So if you throw a few mythological references in there, you're going to get your educators on side.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, if it's a kid's show, the logic was you don't actually have to try too hard with the look of the show. You don't have to have a cast of thousands.
Sure.
You can animate it. You can just have one dodgy set and a hand puppet.
All these two. Yeah.
It's really useful workarounds if you go onto children's TV.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting because even Star Trek, which is kind of a separate point, but Star Trek was reviewed initially as if it was a kid's show. They didn't kind of know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And that's not so much because it's mythic aspects. That's because of the sci-fi. That's because of shows like Captain Video and his Video Rangers,
right.
which was the first sci-fi TV show, and really just cemented this idea that on TV, sci-fi is for kids,
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not,
Lost
it's
in
not for,
Space. And yeah.
yeah. And so there was a real trend there to see, and I remember that reading a review by Rod Serling this is before he made Twilight Zone, getting really upset saying, guys, there are adults who like sci-fi and there's nothing on TV for us.
Sure.
What are you doing? So
You know,
Star Trek comes at that real crossover point. Yeah.
Yeah, it just occurred to me that, of course, Jeffrey Hunter, the guy who played the original lead of Star Trek in the first pilot, played Jesus in a film before that, So they're really they're literally going to the source. Like, let's get Jesus for the mythic side of this.
Yeah, Jesus in space. I'd watch that.
Yeah. And of course, Gene was at different points in his life, I think, a voracious atheist and later on more of an agnostic humanist, but he reportedly always was trying to add these elements. He would add who's it? Like Michael Jan Friedman talks about one of the drafts of the motion picture culminating in Kirk in a fist fight with Jesus on the bridge of the Enterprise, just literally going for it, or adding adding things to in the TNG episode Justice, which is the one with the massage planet with all the half naked people running around. They have
actually have that kind of Greco-Roman look going on. Let's face it. Yep.
Yeah, they absolutely did. Yeah. And it fits into the story, but they've got this, for some reason, this god in orbit is apparently some sort of advanced alien, but we never really get into it. It just wants to sort of explore, rebelling against God, which Gene loved that as a trope.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, even when we look at Who Mourns for Adonis, there's that line, do you remember where Kirk says that we find the one God quite adequate. And there's been so much hoo-ha over that line because it doesn't really fit with Gene Roddenberry's vision, right? It just seems quite out of place in the Star Trek mythos, if you like. But there's probably quite very pragmatic reasons for that, given its location on, broadcast television and the kind of social standards of the day. And we know that they edited that script, right? They edited that script to take away suggestions that the female lieutenant is pregnant at the end by Apollo. That was censored out. So there's all these indications that when you're churning out these scripts and you're doing it for broadcast TV, there are going to be compromises, and there's not going to be entirely consistent worldview across every single episode.
Yeah, they find ways to get away with things. I was thinking about the title of the episode, which is nominally a nod to, I guess, Shelley in his elegy for Keats, but also that combination of that name Adonai is a combination of Greek figure Adonis and Adonai, the Hebrew word for Lord. It's almost like they're saying who mourns. Well, they are saying who mourns for God, God is dead.
Absolutely.
But of course they can't get away with that on 60s TV, so they have to kind of slip it in with the classical allusion. Yeah, it's really cool.
That's right, because then it's educational, right?
Yeah, exactly. Let's corrupt your kids now. Come on. I love it when characters on Star Trek, we see them in their free time and they're reading Shakespeare and they're listening to string quartets and they're doing plays. And it seems like we get it. They're cultured. And of course it's a, middle-aged white man's idea of culture from the West. And that's all fine and good. But Star Trek itself also uses myth in its storytelling, I think, to give itself an air of legitimacy. There are 12 episodes of the franchise that have Latin titles, Latin phrases or quotations. And there are many Greek allusions, myth allusions in the episodes of titles as well. And it's we get it. You guys have read some books. We know.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's not as if myth is the only game going on here. As you say, there's Shakespeare, there's Beowulf, there's, there's Dickens, you can just, there's reference after reference after reference to this idea of quote unquote high culture. And it's something that I think particularly in TNG, we get that really laden on. There's this idea of cultural legitimacy, and it's kind of cultural legitimacy by association, right? It's saying,
Yes.
we are a TV show, we're an entertainment franchise, but one day we will be seen
Sure. Yeah.
as the likes of,
Yeah.
you know, myth, legend, Shakespeare, etc. So, yes,
When you have the
definitely.
holodeck, you can just dial up Leonardo da Vinci or any kind of historical character. But before they had a holodeck, all they had was Flint. So they meet Flint, and he's like, I was Moses, and I was Michelangelo, and I was all these people. And they never go back to Flint. And the people always talk about the Apollo episode. I'm surprised that they never did that again, like met other characters. There is the animated series episode where they meet Cuculon, the Aztec or Mayan god. But I'm surprised they didn't meet like Thor or Shiva or some other like a follow up to that sort of episode.
They could have gone through a whole pantheon.
Yeah, they could.
Right.
Yeah, didn't
the whole history of humanity?
Didn't Hercules and Xena like end up beating up on the Norse gods for a while?
Oh God, yes.
They could have done something like
Yeah,
that.
the timelines got really odd there, didn't they?
Yeah.
And at least Star Trek would have like a reasonable in-house reason,
Yeah, right. If there's a figure that would take the place of God in the Star Trek universe, I think there's a good argument to be made for Q, and not just because of his apparent omnipotence, but he's got a real like Old Testament Yahweh vibe. Like he's always watching you, he's always judging you. And as we see as the series unfolds, he's not completely cold. Like he's secretly rooting for us as humanity.
Yeah, and he's that, trickster figure, right? He's testing. He's testing us. He's testing the culture, the species, but with purpose. It's by testing us, by being pushed, even uncomfortably, that we find ourselves. And even Picard, grudgingly acknowledges that yes, we ended up somewhere where we wouldn't have, and sometimes that's a good thing. Like you're right. It's an antagonistic relationship, but one with purpose.
Yeah, it's the angel that we wrestle, I suppose. A discussion about religion in Trek and its depiction on screen in Trek is probably the province of a totally different, separate discussion. But yes. What do you think about the general lack of religious observation that we see on Trek? Mythic storytelling and religious belief, they aren't inextricably tied necessarily, but citizens of the Federation don't seem to believe much in what they can't see. And even in the Apollo episode, like you pointed out, Kirk is fairly resistant to the idea of worshiping or even believing in something like unto a god.
Yes. Although I think, we get a bit of a shift in DS9 with the Bajoran faith. And it's interesting in that series how the non-Bajorans always talk about it as Bajoran mythology.
Yeah.
But the Bajorans talk about it as their religion. And there's this kind of two worldviews, I guess, sometimes meeting, sometimes clashing, that to what to the Bajorans is a firmly held belief is merely a myth to other people.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of where DS9 situates itself. I mean, this idea of deep space. Well, it's only deep space if you're not from there.
Right.
Yeah.
Near Space Nine.
That only works from the perspective of Earth being Sector 00. So there's this idea of two different spaces, but also two different ways of seeing the world. So I think that show in particular is trying to wrestle with the fact, well, we've had this very secular worldview in Star Trek, and yet evidently in the world, religion is incredibly important for a number of people. How do we deal with that? How do we kind of bring that into the fold? And I guess, in a way they do by wrapping religion and myth together and turning a Federation officer into kind of a semi-divine god, right?
Yeah, he can't really deny it when he's literally the prophet. Yeah. I do like the fact that there is no judgment, though. I think when we originally meet the Bajorans, they're seen as this sort of backwater race, and they have this very devout but sort of obdurate devotion to these the prophets, which to a Starfleet officer, it's just, yeah, aliens. Yeah, we see those all the time. Like, it's not, we get it.
Yeah. No
but there's
big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's never an effort to just convince the Bajorans that they're not gods or anything like that. It's totally accepted. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Sisko literally gets pulled up into it as the sort of bridge between those worlds. But yeah, I wonder often if Gene would think of where DS9 ended up. I mean, he was obviously aware of its development, but knowing it as a kind of frontier town sort of setting is one thing, but knowing that it would sort of validate, in a lot of ways, faith and belief, even in something that somebody else just calls an alien, by the end, the last season is like, I wonder if he would have liked that or not.
Yeah, but as you say, it's still a frontier town, so it has that kind of wagon train to the stars kind of feel about it in that respect. And in some ways, the TNG had become a bit too comfortable in its own space. Like, they're practically going home for dinner, right? Everything seems to be quite well known. So in a way, they had to push it out for DS9 and Voyager, where it could be a frontier again. So in some ways, yes, it's going into new grounds by having that religious aspect, but it's also a return to that Roddenberry idea of the frontier, of pushing that boundary and having a discovery. Now, the fact that what they discover, has this religious heart doesn't seem to fit with what we get in TOS. Yeah, it's interesting, but there's one episode that I find really interesting in DS9 is one called The Assignment. And that's the one where Keiko O'Brien gets possessed by an alien. And the alien forces Miles to make adjustments to Deep Space Nine. And he realizes after a while that his wife's controlled by a Par-Wraith, which is kind of, the Prophet's nemesis.
Right.
And it's only when he pieces together his scientific understanding of the Par-Wraiths and Prophets as aliens,
right,
and but also all the mythological stories about them. He needs both of those things to prevail. And by the end of the episode, of course, he's fine. Keiko's fine. Everything's fine. But he can't get there. He can't get there by reason alone. He can't get there by science alone. It's only by listening to everybody's stories about the Bajoran mythologies that he can piece everything together. Yeah. So I find that an interesting one, because it's kind of saying, well, we don't have to get rid of science just because we're being at least open to this other worldview, that the two can coexist in a meaningful way.
Just changing tack, one of the most persistent myths in the world of Star Trek, and one that the show and the people on the show go to a great length to support is, I think, the myth of the Utopia of the Federation, which we see and we are told is a utopia, but we're never, ever shown how it really works and how it's different. It looks like representative American democracy for the most part, but since that we know that doesn't always work, like, what do they have? And it's sort of like we have a thing in America where it's like a guy tells you, oh, I have a girlfriend, she lives in Canada. After a while, you're hearing these stories about this girlfriend in Canada, and you're like, you don't have a girlfriend. This Canadian girlfriend is not real. And they keep telling us about their utopia, but they won't explain how it works. And to me, the utopia of Trek has become sort of the Canadian girlfriend of Trek.
Yeah, I remember once giving a talk about Star Trek, and someone sort of asked me about, well, how does the political and economic system actually work? And, of course, it's this, you hear the crickets and you see the tumbleweeds, as collectively the room full of Trekkies tries to kind of stumble across some answer to that, with no success, I should add. Yeah. So it's really more about the idea of utopia rather than understanding how that might work or how we might get there, which is frustrating, right? Because if you have a fully worked out utopia, then we have a roadmap and we can follow it and we can
right. And it's interesting because it's like, it's just a total black box. And the writers of Trek, or the creators behind it, are always trying to introduce darkness into that world. There's corrupt government figures, political unrest, And it never upsets or unseats the Utopia. And something that I've heard from people that I've talked with is that Trek can't ever really bring down its Utopia or alter its premise significantly because Utopia is its brand. Those are the stories that it tells. And without the brand, there's no stories and there's no revenue.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, Star Trek Picard is interesting because it's kind of saying, things have gone a bit rotten.
Yeah.
Picard has quit. It's not Utopia anymore. It's not what he signed up for. And yet, kind of where that show seems to be going is that no, we can believe in the values of Star Trek. We can believe that it can get back on track.
Yeah.
So even when it introduces darkness, it's so that it can reaffirm the Utopia.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really emphasized in Discovery as well. Every season, the refrain is that we're meeting these bad actors, we're meeting these bad elements, but we're Starfleet. We maintain this Utopia. And in the third season, they take it to the extent where they arrive in the future in a setting that is nominally a dystopia, but their goal is to restore it to what they see as a utopia. Without even really reflecting all that much on the viability of that task or the appropriateness of it. If people from, the year 1000 came to our future and said, okay, we're going to make this place the way that we want it to be in Utopia, I think we'd have some disagreements with them about how that would apply.
Yeah, which is interesting to come back to the religion aspect, is that then those characters have a faith in the Federation. They have faith in Starfleet. The idea of that Utopia is their faith. And you see that very clearly in, the latest season of Star Trek Discovery when they unfurl that the Federation flag.
Yeah.
And the music swells and,
yeah.
we in the audience are supposed to feel uplifted and emotional at the same time. So it's really, really encouraging us to invest in that Utopia. And that, if ever it becomes threatened, or in the case of Star Trek Discovery, is dismantled completely, don't worry, maintain the faith, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Something that I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to mention that I'm fascinated by the way that the stories are presented on Trek. They're presented in an and I think that we forget this sometimes as the series has gone on, but they're really presented in a epistolary way. They're captain's logs. That's the framing device. So we're literally seeing, something that is nominally in the recent past or maybe the far past. We're seeing the deeds of these characters that have been etched onto, these logs, and they're being recounted for you now.
Yes, almost as if, the entire franchise, I guess, is a holographic experience that we've loaded up.
Which was literally done at the end of one series, and we don't like to talk about it.
Yeah, we don't like to talk about that. But
yeah.
You're right. But yeah, it's kind of when you think about that, then the whole thing is kind of premised on that approach, that narrative device. And because our topic is myth, I've got to tie it back. And that is with, you get with mythic storytelling such as Homer's Odyssey is structured around these flashbacks about telling the tale, recounting what happened. Let's go to the episode where he meets the Cyclops and what happens next after that.
Yeah.
Those kind of framing devices for, yes, this has happened. This is my log. This is my account of my adventures. It's a really ancient mythic storytelling device. You frame it through the captain, Odysseus, or Ulysses in the romantic version, and it's his story to tell, and he's the prime narrator. And you might get these other narrators coming in, giving their little perspectives as well. But yeah, it's the captain's log. Homer's Odyssey is the captain's log.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that modern or later Trek shows, I don't know if they're both embracing that and sort of trying to slough that off. I think I'm not sure if that sort of epic or self-consciously epic storytelling is what appeals to more modern viewers. Later shows have, I think I don't know, I think they rely on that less, but I think in a lot of ways later shows are more reliant on Trek mythology, the canon of Trek, if you will, Memory Alpha, Chapter 12, verse 35, than they've ever been. Like to the point where they barely stand as texts on their own. Enterprise and Discovery, they introduce like their own original elements, but they operate almost completely within the pre-established realm of the franchise. And a show like Lower Decks is so completely dependent on TNG and earlier shows that. That's all that is on order here. Like every show is just sort of a review or an homage or a look back at previous material in the Enterprise. Like the snake is tasting its tail and saying, "Oh, this is pretty good."
Yeah, I mean, I think the franchise learnt to do that when Enterprise first dipped in its ratings.
Oh, you think so?
And
okay.
tried to. I think they really tried to claw back their ratings by being much more self-referential, and decided that was the way to go. But I guess there's this idea that if you're going to go for these grand narratives where everything connects to everything else, then to tell one story is always to retell another one. And that's the logic. That's the logic of myth, right? Is that you can reinvent the myth, you can retell it, but the memory of the other ones are still there, and they serve a function. They're part of the storytelling. You can't, even if you wanted to, you can't cut it off. So it's actually kind of pointless trying to do standalone and not reference, because to have any kind of continuity in that story world, it's going to have to be connected to it in some way. It's really quite tricky to do. Having said that, I'm glad that at least with the latest season of Discovery and with Picard, that they've finally gone back to the future and not the future's past or the past future, or how do we even term those prequels?
I understand. Yeah.
Because if we're supposed to have faith in the future, well, then take me to the future. Don't take me to the future of the past or the past of the future.
Yeah.
One of those things that gives Janeway a headache.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's really what Picard represents at this time. And, with their other proposed shows, I wonder if they will be able to also go to the future of the future. Or now, since we have Discovery in the 32nd century, it's the present of the future. Or again, headache. Don't know how to let's call it. But
the tenses just get too confusing.
Yeah. Before we go, I wanted to talk quick about fans, the devotees of Trek, and the literal devotion that they put into what they love, and how, I guess, Dark Cloud, and then we'll have Sunshine after, but how, if we think about Dark Cloud first, if we think about how if Trek is the text is the canon, you've got fans who in their enthusiasm are creating paratextual material, fan films, fan creation, fan art, and which is amazing, but always exists on this knife edge, trying to avoid, the eye of Sauron, or in this case, CBS, being, castigated, having things taken down as copyright violations, and it's tough. They have to stomp out the heretics.
Yeah, absolutely. Although there has been a shift over time, because in the 90s, in the Viacom years, that was very litigious back then. And, a lot of sites were being actively taken down and sent legal warnings and what have you. And look, there's still an element of that. But I guess what I would point to is the fact that in the Viacom years, they were telling all the fan sites to close down or stop using any copyrighted material, including images. So you couldn't even put a picture up of Kirk on your fan site. Yeah. And directing everybody to go to the official website. Then in the transfer, that their official website kind of sat dead for a while. And when it came back up, all of a sudden they actually had links to the fan sites.
Yeah.
There's that real transition from Web 1.0 to 2.0 where they kind of cottoned on to the fact, well, hang on, our fans are also our biggest consumers. Why are we antagonizing so much? I don't want to make too much of a utopian deal out of that, because, if you do link, if you are linked to their websites, sometimes, you have to give up some legal rights around your material. So, it's not a utopian space, and I think that's very much a grey zone that keeps getting negotiated between the franchise and the fans, and it's
Yeah.
it's always a little bit tentative and tiptoey. But I think there has been a little bit of a shift in acknowledging, well, all that paratextual material, all those additional add-ons, they generate interest, right? They generate interest in
Absolutely.
the franchise.
Yeah, for
They
sure.
are part of the franchise.
Yeah, and in many ways, like fans, and here's the sunny part, have created amazing spaces in the real world, sort of bringing the world of Trek alive. The three-dimensional text that you describe into Boldly Go. There is, of course, and this is, of course, corporate Paramount, but there was the Star Trek Experience in Vegas with Quark's Bar, which is probably the closest that any of us could have ever come to, being on Deep Space Nine or being in a Star Trek, on a Star Trek ship. There's a local con that I go to, and for the last 20 or so years, a local Star Trek group has recreated as like a party room several TOS ship like areas.
Oh, terrific.
They have like a mess hall type situation. They have like a control room and a bridge. And you can go in there and you can order food from the food dispensers, and then somebody behind the wall will like you can put your card in, and then it goes beep, 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 and then the thing opens and it's like a green marshmallow treat or a red marshmallow treat or whatever. And there is no reason to do that other than just, would you like to hang out on the Star Trek Enterprise for a little while? And I just think that's amazing.
And the answer is yes, of course.
Of course I want to.
And if I'm ever your way, you're going to have to take me there, because I so want to go right now.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
See, this is the thing: is that where even for adults, we want to play, right?
Yeah.
We want to play in these worlds, and we spend so much of our imaginative time inhabiting those worlds. Why not do it physically? Whether it's something that the franchises put on or whether it's something that the fans put on.
Yeah.
It's that idea of entering that mythic world and for a moment, imagining that you could be one of its heroes, that kind of Mary Sue.
Sure. Yeah.
Impulse that I think we all have, right? There's that real attraction to making it physical and doing it with other people who kind of understand those worlds and understand the game.
Yeah.
When I went to Star Trek: The Experience in Las Vegas, because I hang out there for a very long time because I knew I wanted to write about it. Mm-hmm. That's my official excuse. My unofficial excuse was I was just having a really good time, chatting to other fans and
sure.
And chatting to the actors, because they had actors in full prosthesis,
sure, yeah,
as the aliens, which I was really enjoying, and they were completely in character, and so you could have these conversations. And I had a Ferengi who wanted me to give money to his orphanage fund. And when I pressed him on it, it turned out they hadn't actually made a profit yet because of his administrative fees.
Sure, there's expenditures. Yes, of course.
There's expenditures. Yeah. And I bought a tribble and made a Klingon flinch and things going on. But at one point, because I've been there so long and I was obviously getting right into it, one of the Klingons started speaking to me in Klingonese. And it was just like, oh my goodness. And, I hate, this is, people say, you're not a real fan. I can't speak Klingonese. I never learned.
Yeah.
I didn't go that far. I've never been able to do that. But I was just blown away because I thought, you're not just an actor, you're a fan, right? You've chosen this job because this is your dream job. You get to be a fully convincing Star Trek alien. I mean, the prosthesis was, impeccable. But you can play with that encounter. Obviously, they had some scripted lines to get them started, but they had cast fans and if they met other fans, they could just get right into it, including speaking Klingonese. It's like, wow, that's just amazing.
I directed an entire play that was a Klingon version of A Christmas Carol, and it was translated by fans, from the original Dickens, and then presented as, a similar story where Scrooge is a Klingon who has lost his honor instead of losing his holiday spirit, and so the spirits visit him and he's got to get it back. So yeah, the things that fans create, just completely outside of the franchise is amazing and a testament to their devotion.
Absolutely.
Well, Djoymi, thanks so much for talking with me. I mean, this is a bottomless subject. We could discuss forever. So we'll have to have you back on the show again in the future. Where can people find you in the meantime online?
So if you go to RMIT University, I've got a page there and you'll see a link to some of the things that I've written. I also had a recent chat with Roberta Pearson on Henry Jenkins' blog, where we get into Star Trek Picard. So that was really good fun as well.
Great. And I've got a link to that I can put in the show notes so people can find that.
Terrific. Thanks for that.
Well, thanks so much again, Djoymi. It was great talking with you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having me.